Hi, how's it going? Welcome back. Today I want to do a little reflection, a retrospective of my project last year, which was listening through the Rolling Stones 500 Greatest Albums of All Time. And I completed that goal, got to the #1 album on December 30th after starting it exactly a year ago on the 1st of January with number 500. And it's been a really interesting journey. I've enjoyed almost all of it, and I love stats. I love like putting numbers to things. So I have lots of things to share with you. Some of them were surprising, and some of them I kind of expected. But I added up actually the length of all these albums. And the total length that I listened to last year ended up being 22,900 minutes of music, which is 381 hours or a little under 16 straight days of listening, which is a lot of music. I had to skip, I had to skip several of the albums, so I didn't actually end up listening to all 500. I skipped, in fact, 29, so I listened to 471, which is still a lot. The reasons for the skips I talked about earlier in the year, some of them were unavailable or only available on like on record or on CD, not on YouTube, not on streaming, or completely out of print and not available anywhere. So those, obviously, I guess I could have bought the CD, but I chose not to. But beyond the ones that were just generally unavailable for general listening, there's a lot of albums. In fact, let me see if I can pull this up. There are a lot of albums on here that were greatest hits and compilations. Lots and lots and lots. Elton John had the greatest hits. We had several by just various artists that were like just compilations. That was not really what I wanted to do this year for two reasons. One, the length of these albums meant that my goal, which was listening to roughly 10 albums a week, would be very stretched just because of the amount of time that I'm able to listen every week. And then on the other hand, and I have talked about this in other videos, like greatest hits I feel like don't really belong on a list of greatest albums. You know, so the single format has to be collated, has to be collected and anthologized into a collection in order to be listened to. I understand that, but putting the output of an artist into a collection and calling that the greatest album of all time, I feel like was not really what a list like this should have been about. So that's just me. So as it is, I skipped 29 albums. Now I was rating these on a 0 to 4 scale. So I ended up, here are my stats for how I rated these 500 or 470 albums. I gave 34 of them a rating of 0. These are albums that I couldn't stand, I hated, and I hope I never hear again. They absolutely don't belong on a list of greatest or even good or even moderately mediocre songs. Hated them. 34 of those. I gave 83 albums a 1. And a 1 is basically, it was really bad, but there was a couple elements about it. There was a great song or a good performance or something like that. Something that saved it from being complete garbage. I gave 2 rating to 117 of these albums. And a 2 is just a good record. Would listen to it again, but not particularly excellent in any way. I gave 115 a rating of 3, which is sort of the opposite of a 1. If it got a 3, it was almost great, but there's 1 or 2 things that sort of held it back, but otherwise was really, really excellent. Definitely above average. And then 120 albums got a 4 rating, which in my opinion were the truly great records that really belonged on this list. Like I said, I skipped 29, and then 2 albums, which were sort of anomalies, I gave a rating of 3 question marks. And those are just sort of weird ones that I didn't know what to do with. And one of those was Suicide's self-titled album, which was, I still don't know exactly what to do with. Definitely memorable, a little disturbing. That was number 441 on the list. I can't recommend that you listen to it, but maybe check it out. It's a wild ride. It's just a guy mumbling into a microphone with I think he had like a transistor radio and an organ and a drum machine, and that was it. Really, really weird. And then the other one that I gave a 3 question mark rating to was Trout Mask Replica, number 60, by Captain Beefheart and his Magic Band. And that is another singular album that raised more questions than it answered. Really, also just super strange, and I can't recommend that you really listen to that unless you're interested in sort of esoteric and obscure odd music. My big takeaway, well, there are several takeaways from me, but the biggest one I think was that there's not really a greatest album. I think there are basic standards for what could be considered good. Like sound quality is, if you can't understand what's happening in the album, then that sort of takes away from its possibility of being great. But for me, my definition of what makes great music is going to be different than somebody else's, and I think that's just down to how we perceive, how we experience music, what our musical background is, our cultural background, things that we bring to the listening experience. There's a lot of music on here that I don't understand why it's there. Some of it is because I don't like the artist, and some of it is because I don't understand what the artist is trying to get through. Elvis Costello and the Smiths in particular were 2 groups or artists that, in my opinion, were super overrated. Between the 2 of them, they had 9 or 10 records on this list, and almost none of them belonged in any list of good albums at all. And I abused the Smiths greatly in my reviews. I haven't talked very much about Elvis Costello because his music to me is so bland, boring, mediocre, and uninteresting that there's not really a lot to say about it. Definitely overrated. I was surprised to say that there are several albums that I thought should be on this list that weren't. So sort of the missed opportunities. I know I talked about greatest hits being not appropriate to a list like this, but the Eagles' greatest hits album wasn't on this list, and it's one of the greatest best-selling records in history. I was kind of surprised that wasn't on there. I think Pink Floyd's Animals should have been on this list. There was a lack of early jazz, like I think Louis Armstrong, his Red Hot 5 and 6 groups, some of those albums should have been on here, and that's a collection of singles as well that should have made the list. No Duke Ellington, and then there's no classical music at all, even though there have been a lot of important classical recordings in the 20th century that I think belong on lists of greatest albums of all time, including Carlos Kleiber's recording of the Beethoven Symphonies 5 and 7 should have been on this list, and Glenn Gould's recording of either The Art of the Fugue or The Well-Tempered Clavier. You know, things like that made a difference in music on the classical side of things, whereas this list is almost completely preoccupied with rock and pop music from the 60s and the 70s, and less from the 80s and 90s, and almost nothing from the 50s or the 2010s. Overall, though, it's definitely a group of interesting albums. You can't go wrong there, and I would definitely recommend that you check out any of these albums and see for yourself how you feel about them. I don't really have, I haven't prepared a top 20 of my own from here, but if you are interested in seeing how I rated the 4 ratings, you can go on there. Albums that really stood out to me that I hadn't heard before were The Pretender by Jackson Browne, that's a big one. Bonnie Raitt really impressed me. All the albums, almost all the albums by The Police are excellent and worth listening to. Elton John definitely came out among the top of my listening ratings this year. Almost all of his albums got a 4 for me. Really, really incredible. Great songwriting, great player. I think the best hip-hop album that I heard this year was Enter the Wu-Tang 36 Chambers by Wu-Tang Clan. The Fugees also had a really, really good album, The Score. And I enjoyed a lot of the other hip-hop albums on this list, but a lot of them had super great moments and then just enough bad tracks or sounds or something like that that kept them from, in my opinion, being considered great albums. I will admit that I'm not the biggest rap fan. That's why I sort of there weren't as many highly rated hip hop albums on this list as maybe other people would put. What else? Radiohead impressed me. The Beatles, of course, were. I was happy to say that they impressed me more as I listened to them further. Jeff Buckley kind of jumped out as his album Grace, which I had never heard of before, really jumped out as a really amazing record. It was a really fun experience, something that I was able to talk to with my family about and my friends, and you know, think about what makes a piece of music great, what makes an album great, what makes a song great. And at the end of this, I think greatness comes down to a couple of elements. It has to be a great song. It has to be excellently performed. It has to sound good. And I think, too, that great albums have to have a timeless quality. They have to be relevant not only to the time that they're in, the time that they're released, or the time that they're written and released, but also to future generations. If it is only pertinent to its own time, I'm not sure that it could be considered great in the true, like, deep sense of the word. If you've heard some of these albums and disagree with what I thought, let me know, and maybe you can educate me and let me know what I didn't hear, and I'll go back and check them out. I am not doing a listening challenge again in 2019. I've got something else sort of planned, which I'll talk about later. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I had a great time, and I'm definitely gonna remember listening to these 500 albums all this year.